Welcome to the Teach Me Lit podcast. I'm Sophie Tuvey and I love talking about books and helping you to revise for English literature and go deeper in the texts you're studying.
What was life like for girls in Jane Austen's day? Well, we've got to use our own experiences to try and empathise with some of these female characters. And I think lockdown has actually done us a favour in this regard. If you consider what you did in lockdown to amuse yourself, then actually you're going to start to see some parallels with some of these heroines in Jane Austen's novels. If you're an unmarried girl living in the 1800s, you know, your options of what to do are fairly limited because you weren't supposed to go out unchaperoned, alone. And if you lived in the country, there might only be a few families that you could see on a social level. Plus, you would have to walk if a carriage wasn't available. So if it rained, you'd have to stay at home. And life was just had a very small radius, if you like. Unless you were more wealthy, in which case, you know, you could maybe travel further afield. Now, if thinking about lockdown, you know, many of us were dependent on a daily walk. We weren't really supposed to use our cars unless it was essential. And so our lives became a lot smaller. And whilst, of course, we have the advantages of technology that Jane Austen certainly didn't, I think perhaps we all hit our limit with Zoom and screens and games consoles. We all sort of started to appreciate a walk or reading a book, a board game with a family member, things like that. And it's interesting because obviously life for girls in Jane Austen's day was very reduced in that way, you know, and in thinking about education, many of us were, you know, learning online in lockdown, and many people found that a very frustrating experience. For girls, unless your parents paid for a governess, you didn't really have much education. You were very self-dependent. You know, if your parents had access to books, then perhaps you could read some books. But, you know, basically you're self-taught. And that's the situation for Elizabeth and Jane Bennet, for example. They're accessing books through the circulating library and through their father's library. But they're very much self-taught. They have no one to teach them anything. And so just like in lockdown, you find, you know, you hit your limit on what you can learn. I think that was very similar for girls in Austen's day as well. And I think this kind of dynamic, it really helps us understand the story. I saw an Amazon review of Pride and Prejudice, you know, just a bunch of people sitting in each other's living rooms. I think it was tongue-in-cheek, to be fair. But yeah, essentially that is the point. That is the point, that Austen's world was, you know, she was a single unmarried woman. You know, that the like daily routine would have been very monotonous. And that helps to explain the choices that the characters make, because in Pride and Prejudice we're introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet sniping at each other in chapter 1, Mr. Bennet winding Mrs. Bennet up, pretending he's not going to visit Bingley, the newest eligible bachelor to move into the neighbourhood, and of course her tearing her hair out because if Mr. Bennet doesn't visit him, then she can't be introduced to him as an acquaintance. And they're just sniping each other because they've been married, presumably for 20 odd years under this same roof. They've got 5 daughters and they're all just driving each other crazy. And again, I think lockdown can help us understand that sort of stir crazy mentality of, you know, you're all confined in a relatively small space. They're all under one roof, and you've got Lydia and Kitty, the youngest girls, running wild with all this energy. You've got Mary, who keeps reading out loud from sermon books and practicing endlessly on the piano. Jane and Elizabeth sort of find solace in each other. And Mr. Bennet just disappears to the library. And poor Mrs. Bennet just keeps screeching about her poor nerves, imagining that she's having a nervous breakdown all the time, which, you know, is fairly understandable given their situation. So lockdown can really help us understand this essential status of boredom that girls had to go through. And it helps us to understand why some things are a big deal, like a little assembly where they get to meet Bingley and have dancing. These things are a big deal to this community, and it's why it's so offensive when, you know, Darcy turns up and refuses to dance with anyone, even though there's not enough partners for the girls. It helps people to understand why everyone reacts so strongly against him, and why that what we would see as very small news is actually big news for this family. But there is another reason why Bingley's moving into the neighbourhood is such big news, and that's because of the Bennet's particular situation with the entail on Longbourn, which is Mr. Bennet's estate. Basically, there's a legal stipulation that the property has to pass to the nearest male relative upon Mr. Bennet's death, and because he's had 5 daughters, none of them are eligible to inherit it. And it's going to pass to, as we find out later, Mr. Collins, who is one of Mr. Bennet's cousins. So it's interesting that they're in this situation because you've got 5 middle-class girls. You know, they are not really educated. They're not going to be able to have any kind of meaningful employment unless they want to sort of, I don't know, become some kind of governess to children in a wealthy family, which, you know, is a kind of form of servitude really, which nobody really wants. And so they can't really earn their own living. They can't gain any financial independence. And Mr. Bennet hasn't saved any money for them, so they've got no fortune at all anyway. So for Mrs. Bennet, she's constantly worried what's going to happen when Mr. Bennet dies, because they won't be able to stay in Longbourn. It'll be passed along to this relative that at this point in the novel she doesn't really know. And she's desperate to get the girls married. So Bingley, with 4,000 or 5,000 a year, a good income, has moved into the neighbourhood, and he's a bachelor. So instantly she's thinking, yes, if he can marry one of her girls, then this will be a game changer for them. It's a little bit like Charlie Bucket's golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Marriage is going to be the magic solution to all of life's problems. Because if a girl gets married, then she's financially secure with her husband. She has more freedom to go out and about in society. And obviously, you actually get to leave home, which for all these girls, you know, growing up in these confined circumstances was what, you know, it was the ticket they were waiting for. They didn't really perhaps think much about what was going to happen after that, because the sad reality was once a woman was married, she usually ended up in a cycle of pregnancy and confinement for the next foreseeable future of her, you know, her fertile years, as it were. But I don't think that was something that they really thought about that much. So basically, Mr. Bennet, in visiting Bingley, which he does, opens up this acquaintance which Mrs. Bennet is really hoping is going to result in this golden ticket, and that's really what's going to propel the story forward. And it's really important for us to always remember the smallness of the girls' lives. You know, if they get an offer of marriage and they refuse it, there's very few people around to, you know, make them any offers. And it's a bit like, you know, today we've got social media, you know, even in our schools, you know, we've got schools of 800 to 1,000 people. So our circles are huge compared to, you know, these rural girls in this rural area. If, for example, somebody asks us out and we say no, we're not that concerned about never meeting anyone ever again. But, you know, imagine again, I'm thinking back to the lockdown world. Imagine you've literally got, you know, your neighbours on your street and that's it. It's going to matter a lot more, isn't it? It's going to matter a lot more if somebody makes you an offer or not, because you're thinking, gosh, who else is out there? And for a family like the Bennets, you know, they're not moving in upper social circles. They're not likely to rub shoulders with immensely wealthy people. They don't have what in Austen's day is known as connections. And that's something that Bingley's sister and even Darcy pick up on with the Bennets, that they have poor connections. They've got, you know, family in Meryton, Their uncle's an attorney. They've got an uncle in Cheapside in London who's in trade. And they conclude that, they have no family of importance. They have no connections. And so for Elizabeth and Jane, their prospects of marriage are not great. Because, as Darcy points out, it materially lessens their chances of securing a good match with the circles that they move in. And so this is one reason why it becomes so important that the girls will seize every opportunity to marry whenever they get an offer. And it's why Elizabeth's behaviour is so exasperating to her mother, Mrs. Bennet, because Elizabeth's got this headstrong desire to secure her own happiness. And so Elizabeth is not going to listen to the advice of a friend like Charlotte Lucas, who says, happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. Basically take whatever you can get. And that's obviously what Charlotte herself does in marrying Collins. Elizabeth is determined to act in the way that will secure her own happiness, which means not just marrying for money, not just going with the first offer that you get. And that behaviour, of that independence of spirit, is really admirable in Elizabeth, but it really makes her stand out from the other female characters in the novel.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and found it helpful, please hit subscribe and share it with a friend. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter. Just search for Teach Me Lit. I'm always open to requests, so if you want me to talk about a text you're studying, get in touch. Thank you for listening. See you next time on the Teach Me Lit podcast.